God and Father in heaven, we're so thankful to thee for the beautiful day that you granted us. We're thankful for this time that we can come together to worship you and to be able to dive into your word, to study, to know. Heavenly Father, be with us as we learn from your word. Help us to make good application of those things that we see from your word. That we may live according to your will, that we may please you and bring honor and glory to you. Heavenly Father, we're mindful of many that are suffering, facing difficulties, many that are sick, those that are facing treatment. We pray your blessing on all of those. Also, ask that you be with and comfort those that have lost loved ones recently due to the particular family that they're mourning their loss. Heavenly Father, there are so many that are facing hardship during this time. We pray your blessing upon them. Pray that they will lean upon thee. They will find their refuge. Father, we pray that you be with those mothers today, blessing them. We're mindful of the reason that we are here is because of the mother. And so we are thankful for that. We're thankful for the opportunity to have life that's been granted us. We know that many times government tries to intercede, make laws that would take away life. Heavenly Father, if it be possible, we pray that those things be overturned, and that life may again resume, and life will not be taken away by the hands of the government, by the hands of the people. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for the blessing to be able to be here today, to be able to know that you are our God, to worship you. Be with us this day as we enter into our study of Jeremiah. We pray that we can glean what we need from thy word. We thank you, pray in Jesus' name. Well, good morning. Thank you, Brother Adam. So let's look at we'll be picking up in Jeremiah chapter 48 this morning. I believe we left off in about verse 19 and 20 there. So we'll pick up in verse 21 in Jeremiah chapter 48. I wanted to go over our two questions from last week. When Elisha restored the son of the Shunammite woman to life, what was the first thing that the boy did? Did he give thanks to the Lord? Did he sneeze? Did he rise from his sick bed? Or did he eat some bread dipped in oil? Who thinks maybe A? He gave thanks to the Lord. That he sneezed? That he rose from his sick bed? Or ate some bread dipped in oil? That's very, very odd thing to read, I guess, as far as some of the choices go. But he sneezed 7 times. So that's interesting. In 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse 35, Elisha had laid over him and he had sneezed 7 times and something else. I can't remember exactly. But very interesting. So I guess if you didn't know that, you would think maybe that, my first thought would be that maybe he ate and he was hungry or something. But interesting, he did sneeze. And the next question we had was, whose mother-in-law did Jesus heal? Was that Simon or Peter's mother-in-law? Was it Nicodemus? Was it a centurion? Or was it Bartholomew? So who thinks maybe A, Peter, B, Nicodemus, a centurion, C,
or Bartholomew D. And yes, that was Simon Peter, and there's other passages in the gospel accounts that you could reference, but Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 and 15, we'll use that as a reference, and it's specifically stated there. All right, very good, very good. So for next week, which book tells the story of Isaiah healing Hezekiah the king with some figs, a poultice, I guess is how you say that, of figs, poultice of figs. And then when Miriam led the women in song and dance after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, she used this instrument. So those will be the two questions for next week. I'll leave those up there for just a moment. And we'll pick up in chapter 48 of Jeremiah concerning the judgment on the nation of Moab. Now, just kind of a quick recap last week. The first 10 verses we looked at the destruction that was coming upon Moab, and that it would have been better for them to flee to the wilderness, as verse 6 says, flee, save your lives, and be like the heath in the wilderness, or be like a tree or a bush that may be alone, to flee this area and to try to escape this destruction that's coming. Verse 9, give wings unto Moab. Some translations say to sow it with salt, and of course a city that was destroyed, that was a practice there, and we reference Judges chapter 9 and verse 45. In other words, they were to flee, to go away, never to return again. In other words, that there was this destruction that was coming. And then we see the character of Moab in verses 11 through 16, and we get the idea that Moab had their confidence misplaced. It was in the wrong place. They had their confidence in their god, Chemosh, this false god, and they had, as revealed in verse 13, and they had lived in a relatively peaceful life, it seems, hadn't had a whole lot of conflict, as we understand here. Verse 11, very interesting, Moab had been at ease, or they had been at peace or at rest from his youth for a long period of time. They had been settled on the lees. In other words, like a wine that is setting on the shelf and it is allowed to ferment and allowed that aroma and all of those things, the sediment to collect on the bottom. They had been undisturbed, but that was going to change. They were going to be taken into captivity. And verse 12 reveals that these vessels will be emptied, the bottles will be broken, and they will be disappointed, verse 13, or ashamed, as the King James translates, in their false god Chemosh. And we made it all the way down to verse 20, and describes the calamity that's going to come upon them, the lamentation in verse 17 through 20 that the people would experience. They would show grief. The King James says, all that are about him bemoan him, or they would show grief or lament him. All that know him will ask the question, in other words, how is the strong staff broken and the beautiful rod? And they had lived so much peace and prosperity. They had done what they want. And verse 18, that they will now sit in thirst. The spoiler Moab shall come upon thee and shall destroy thy strongholds. They would be no more at peace. They would no more be able to glory or think so highly of themselves. And as we'll see, it's going to be stated specifically in the passages that we will look at this morning, just how prideful they were. They thought too much of themselves and too much of the things that they had. So now we're in verses 21 through 25, and there's going to be a very lengthy list of cities that are mentioned. In other words, we'll understand the totality of the destruction. It's all over the entire nation. And some of these cities have specific meaning to their names, as we have seen previously with some of the other cities that are mentioned. But the main idea that we'll get from verses 21 through 25 is the massive destruction. Is that they will not be able to do anything with the destruction that Babylon is bringing. They can't turn away from it, or they can't They can't stop Babylon from destroying them. All of these cities, all over the nation, are going to be destroyed. So in verse 21, starting, and judgment is come upon the plain country, and the plain country can also be translated as a tableland or this level country, upon Holon, and upon Jahaza, and upon Mephath, and upon Dibon, and upon Nebo, and upon Beth Diblathahim, and upon Kirathaim, and upon Beth Gamul, and upon Beth Meon, and upon Kirio, and upon Basra, and upon all the cities of the land of Moab, far or near. The horn of Moab is cut off, and the arm is broken, saith the Lord. So several cities there, and you can pronounce those any way you want. I gave you my version, but some of those definitely difficult to pronounce. But we get the idea here that all of these places, and Jahaza, Jahaza, there in verse 21, the latter part of verse 21, can mean trodden underfoot. And that is an Amorite city also that's mentioned in Numbers 21, 23 through 25. It was an Amorite city, rather, that the Israelites overtook in Numbers 21, that is mentioned at this time, most likely due to the divided kingdom and the Assyrians. Reuben would have occupied that area at this time, but because of the Assyrian captivity, Reuben no longer had control of that, so it seems that Moab now occupied that part of the country. That was a city that was mentioned here. And the next city there, Mephath, means splendor. That city name means splendor. So the idea here in some of these cities and their names and what they might think of these, or what these cities may be known for, they're all going to be overtaken. So maybe the splendor, Mephath, is going to be overtaken. Dibon and Nebo, these have already been mentioned. And then the Beth Diblathahim means house of fig cakes. And maybe the same city as another one that's mentioned, but Israel rested here on its way to Canaan, and that's mentioned in Numbers 33 and verse 46. The next city there in verse 23, not the Kirathaim, but the next one upon Beth Gamul, means house of recompense. Beth Meon means house of habitation, and these are all cities located within certain miles of one another. In verse 24, Kirioth was a place of worship of the god Chemosh. So that is specifically mentioned in one of those cities that would be destroyed. So what good would their false god do for them? He can't protect one of the cities in which their worship took place. And then the latter part of verse 24, Basra was a fortified place, so even some of the fortifications wouldn't stand up. And then, just to clarify, at the end of verse 24, and upon all the cities of the land of Moab, far or near. So if you don't get the point from the listing of these particular places, these well-known places that are known by other names for things that they may offer, or the way people may think of those cities in high regard, all of them far or near. They're going to suffer from this. The horn of Moab is cut off. In other words, the strength that Moab has, the security that they may feel is cut off. In other words, like a cut off, and the arm is broken. So how useful would a soldier in a battle be with a broken arm? Perhaps maybe even their right-handed and their right arm is broken. How useful are they? It's interesting. At one time I was thinking of signing up to the reserve units in as far as Carver County's deputies go. And I was talking to the SRO up at the school, and he said, yeah, you'll have to qualify with the firearm. He said, you'll have to shoot so many rounds with your right hand and so many rounds, this way and that way. He said, you'll have to shoot left-handed too. And I thought, wow, I've never shot left-handed at all. I don't know if I could hit anything because it'd be just so awkward trying to shoot left-handed. But in case your right hand was incapacitated in something, you would need to be able to do that, and you wouldn't want that to be the first time you tried. So very, very interesting thought. But here, the broken arm, the soldier wouldn't have the same power. He wouldn't be as effective as he would with his good arm intact. And this is the idea here that strength is cut off. So Moab is left unable to defend themselves. In verses 26 through 29, we see the shame and reproach that is going to be brought upon Moab, and the way that they had thought of themselves and the way that they would feel after the fact. Shameful, and the way other people, the other nations may look at them in contrast to the way they felt about themselves. And that's brought out specifically here. So let's look at verses 26 through 29. Make him drunken. Isn't it? Jeremiah uses God inspiring Jeremiah here, the Holy Spirit inspiring Jeremiah to use the words here. And Jeremiah uses that illustration a couple of times throughout the book, and yet again here about them being drunken. And it's interesting in talking about Judah in chapter 13, in mentioning their pride. The illustration, again, is used about them being drunken and the bottles being dashed together, and the result of that. And here, in mentioning, for he magnifieth himself, the word magnifieth can be also translated their prideful thought. They had magnified themselves. They had raised themselves up to be something that they were not. They had too much pride in themselves. They had increased themselves, or they had boasted of themselves. But make him drunken, for he magnifieth himself against the Lord. Moab shall wallow in his vomit, and he shall also be in derision. What a very dirty, nasty way to think about the situation Moab would be in. But that's naturally follows drunkenness, is those that may have too much to drink and their body rejects that chemical, that narcotic, that drug. Their body rejects it, and often they may vomit, and they will wallow in it. So very, very nasty scene, but this is the result of their pride. And then as a result of that, they will be seen as, the King James says, a derision or a laughing stock, or they will be mocked as a result of it. So pride, the idea of pride throughout the Scriptures, and there's many illustrations in the Old Testament, just in the book of Jeremiah, but also even in the book of Esther, you see Haman. What good did his pride do for him? He ended up being hung on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. So, and Solomon mentions pride throughout his writings. So pride is a very dangerous thing for people to have, especially when the pride interferes. Well, it's good to take pride in that you want to do a good job and be diligent in your efforts, but to be full of pride, as these people are, and allow that to puff you up and you think that you are something that you are not, is where the problem comes in. But these people had allowed it they had allowed themselves to be magnified against the Lord, that they would result in being a laughing stock. Verse 27, for was not Israel a derision unto thee? You thought that Judah Or Israel, the nation of Israel at times were a derision. You looked at them as a laughing stock. You mocked them. Looks like the tables have turned on you, Moab. You have been too prideful for too long, and now your day of reckoning is here. For was not Israel a derision unto thee? Was he not found among thieves? For since thou spakest of him, thou skippeth for joy. The King James translates that word, skippeth for joy. And I don't particularly like that translation. The word can also mean show grief or wag the head. I think that would probably be in other translations. Can't remember what the American Standard says. I think the American Standard says something better there, but I may be wrong. I looked at several different translations, English Standard, American Standard, and some others, and they translate that in a way that I think better conveys the idea here that they had thought of Israel one way, that they wagged their head and thought, oh man, I'm so glad we're not like Israel, mocking Israel. They're just, they were found among thieves, just like, they had done such a bad thing, and they so glad that we're not in the same shape they're in, kind of thing. We're so much better, is the idea that's portrayed here in verse 27. And the phrase, maybe I'm just not understanding, but skippeth for joy just doesn't seem to portray that same idea. So, yeah, okay. Well, yes, think about it like that, as being a mockery, and you skippeth for joy, kind of like, I'm happy I'm not like you. I guess, yeah, I could see that. Waggeth the head, yeah. Okay, in my opinion, that's a better portrayal here to get the idea of what's being brought out in verse 27. But if I thought about it like JP, I'd be okay. Thank you, JP, for adding that there. And then verse 28. O ye that dwell in Moab, leave the cities and dwell in the rock, and be like the dove that maketh her nest in the sides of the hole's mouth. So the idea is, the phrase that giving them wings that they may fly away, and being in the desert, being alone, has already been brought out. And here, give them wings like a dove that they may fly. You think about a dove or any bird would be able to fly up the high places on the side of a mountain where what predators could bother them? I mean, there's very few that could probably get to some places that these doves could fly. And here's the idea. In the cleft of the rock, in these holes in the sides of the mountains, that's where they would need to flee to for safety, to make their nest there in the sides of the mountains so that they could escape the danger. Verse 29, we have heard the pride of Moab. So there it's specifically stated, the pride of Moab. He is exceeding proud. His loftiness and his arrogancy and his pride and the haughtiness of his heart. What did Jesus say about those that had pride in Luke chapter 14? Luke chapter 14 and verse 11. Jesus said, for whosoever exalted himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. And this is the opposite here that we see in the nation of Moab. They have not humbled themselves. They exalted themselves. They became so arrogant, the haughtiness of their heart and their pride. And as a result, they're going to be humbled. They're going to be brought low. And what they should understand from this, and as we're fixing to see here in verses 30 through 39, a loving God is what we're going to see. God cares for even this nation that has become pagan, that should not have been that way throughout the many hundreds of years that they had been in existence. They should have followed God. They would have had the law. They would have had the law that Lot and Abraham would have followed, the patriarchal law. They would have known that. All of that would have been passed down, but yet, somewhere along the line, the teaching stopped. Those began to influence them to the pagan ways, and they followed them, and here they are worshiping the false god Chemosh. And look where it got them. We're going to see the lament of God. God feels sorrow for these people, His people that should have followed Him, but yet they went astray. His creation, but they're going to do something different, and we see. I see in this the love of God and God wanting them, and you think about as a father, your children doing something that brings harm to them, and how bad that would make you feel, and you want them to do right, but because they did wrong, out of love, you have to punish them. If you want that correction to take place, you have got to punish them. You have got to make them understand that what they're doing is wrong. That's the only way that they can be corrected. And here's what we see here in the judgment on all of these nations, is that they've got to be corrected. They have done wrong. The influence that is upon them in all of this idolatry and all of these other things, their pride here that Moab has experienced, they've got to be brought down and be humbled. And this is really God showing His love for these people. And even though many will be destroyed, they should learn the lesson from this, as all these nations should. So in verses 30 through 39, I'm going to read this passage. It's a little lengthy there. And I know His wrath, saith the Lord, but it shall not be so. His lies shall not so affect it. Therefore will I howl for Moab, and I will cry out for all Moab. Mine heart shall mourn for the men of Kiriz. O vine of Shibmah, I will weep for thee with the weeping of Jazer. Thy plants are gone over the sea, thy reach even to the sea of Jazer. The spoiler is fallen upon thy summer fruits and upon thy vintage. And joy and gladness is taken from the plentiful field and from the land of Moab. And I have caused wine to fail from the winepresses. None shall tread with shouting. Their shouting shall be no shouting. From the cry of Heshbon even unto Eliah, and even unto Jahaz, have they uttered their voice. From Zoar even unto Horonaim, as an heifer of 3 years old, for the waters also of Nimrin shall be desolate. Moreover, I will cause to cease in Moab, saith the Lord, him that offereth in the high places, and him that burneth incense to his gods. Therefore mine heart shall sound for Moab like pipes, and mine heart shall sound like pipes for the men of Kiriz, because the riches that he hath gotten are perished. For every head shall be bald, and every beard clipped. Upon all the hands shall be cuttings, and upon all the loins sackcloth. There shall be lamentation generally upon all the housetops of Moab, and in the streets thereof. For I have broken Moab like a vessel wherein is no pleasure, saith the Lord. They shall howl, saying, How is it broken? How hath Moab turned their back with shame? So shall Moab be a derision and a dismaying to all them about him. So interesting passage here, talking about this pagan nation and the way that God feels about them. And we see that God cares about them. For Him to mourn these people, and as we'll get down to verse 36, with His heart will sound like pipes. Those are things related to a funeral and the grief and the mourning that people would feel in the passing of a loved one, and how they would mourn during that time. But back to verse 30. I know his wrath, or the fury of the overflowing rage of Moab, saith the Lord, but it shall not be so. His lies shall not so affect it. In other words, it's futile. It's for nothing. It's for naught. It will not accomplish anything. Verse 31, therefore will I howl for Moab, and I will cry out for all Moab. My heart shall mourn for the men of Kiriz. And that's another stronghold of Moab, the city there that's mentioned. But this destitution or this destruction that's going to come upon Moab will be so bad that God is going to mourn for the people. And it's the needs of the people. The people need to turn back to Him. They need to repent. And He is mourning here as a result of their situation. And, God only knows whether that some of these would turn back to Him or whether they'll continue on their path. But there is a reason for this. O vine of Shibma, verse 32. O vine of Shibma, I weep for thee with the weeping of Jazer. Now that's an old Amorite city that was also conquered by Israel, and it's mentioned in Numbers 21 and verse 32. It was taken by Israel as they were wandering in the wilderness, making their way to cross over Jordan. Thy plants are gone over the sea. They reach even unto the sea of Jazer. And some say because there's not a sea there, that maybe this was, some speculate maybe this was a mistranslation, but there very well could have been a sea at this point in time, and there's not now. I mean, it could have dried up, or there could have been some source of water there. Nevertheless, that's what the Scripture tells us, that even unto the sea of Jazer, the spoiler is fallen upon thy summer fruits. So they have nothing. Just as Babylon come through and they took the things that they wanted from Judah, they're going to do the same here. They're going to be left with nothing. Thy vintage, or maybe the wine and the things that they had stored up and the things that they had prepared, they're all going to be gone. Babylon will take those things. And as a result, the joy and the gladness is taken from the plentiful field in verse 33. Those shouts of joy, and that we're so happy with what we've been able to harvest and what we have for ourselves. Because remember, they're so prideful. They value themselves and the things that they were able to do and the peace that they've been able to have for many years. They think all of these things is because of them, and these things that they put their trust and their value in, just like Judah, put their trust in the temple rather than who dwelt in the temple, which was God. They put their trust in the walls and the physical structure rather than in the one that made all of that peace and safety possible. So they were misguided in that aspect. So all of this is taken from the land of Moab. I will cause wine to fail from the wine presses. None shall tread with shouting. There will be no shouting. So the wine press is left empty, and the people are left with sorrow. There's no gladness. There's no joy. So a very grim scene here. In verse 34, the cry of Eshbon unto Eleth and to Jahaz. They have uttered their voice in Zoar. And all the way at the end of that passage, the waters of Nimrim shall be desolate, or they will be wasted or corrupted. So all of your food, even down to the source of their water, is all corrupted or taken away. There's nothing. You have nothing. Everything has been taken away from you. How much pride do you have now, Moab? You put your trust in the wrong things. You put your trust in the wrong God. You put your trust in yourself, and you should not have. And we should be careful with those things today. We live, the country we live in, we are so very blessed with so many things, and we should always remember that our trust should be in God. He is the one that has given us all of those blessings, and we should not let ourselves at any time become too prideful in those things, because they could very well be taken away from us as well. And we don't need to allow ourselves to be led astray any of those things as well. And, verse 35, moreover, I will cause to cease in Moab, saith the Lord, him that offereth in the high places and him that burneth incense to his gods. So here we see another purpose here. They're engulfed in this idolatry, but that's going to cease. Worshipping these gods, worshipping Chemosh in these high places, burning incense to them is all going to be stopped. Wherefore mine heart shall sound for Moab like pipes, weeping of people that are unwilling to repent, is what Moab's situation was. They were unwilling to repent of the evil that they had done, of the idolatry they were engaged in. So, my heart shall sound like pipes for the men of Kiriz, because the riches that they have gotten are perished. For every head shall be bald. Here in verse 37, we see some of the things that pagans would do in a time of distress. They would shave their beard, cut their beards. They would cut themselves, as verse 37 says, and wear the loins, and upon the loins there would be sackcloth. Verse 38, that lamentation will be generally upon the housetops of Moab and in the streets, so everywhere. And if they were anything like Judah, Judah would worship those false gods on the rooftops. But there will be lamentation there and in the streets. And here we have a similar image that we've seen in chapter 19 of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah took the potter's flask and he broke it before those elders and those prominent men that had followed him there. They would be broken the same way. I have broken Moab like a vessel wherein is no pleasure, saith the Lord. A vessel that has a blemish that is undesirable for the potter now. I will destroy it and I will make another one. In other words, in verse 39, they shall howl, saying, How is it broken? How hath Moab turned the back with shame? So shall Moab be a derision and a dismay to all them about him. It's almost like here is a moment of review, prophetic review here in that how this happened. How has it come to this? Well, this is how it's happened. This is how it's come to this, because Moab had turned their back on God. They had turned their back on the true living God, and they started doing things for themselves. They started worshiping false gods. They relished in the things that they thought they had provided for themselves. We have lived at peace for so long. We've been very prosperous. Now, verses 40 through the end of the chapter here, we're going to see the arrival of the nation of Babylon and just how powerful, and we know how powerful Babylon is. We've seen those illustrations that Jeremiah has given to us time and time again. Verse 40, For thus saith the Lord, Behold, he shall fly as an eagle. Babylon would be strong and they would be fast, and shall spread his wings over Moab. Kirioth is taken, and the strongholds are surprised. The mighty men's hearts in Moab at that day shall be as the heart of a woman in her pain. So the strongholds will do nothing for you. The mighty men, those men that would stand up and fight in a battle, they're going to be scared. They're going to be terrified. They're going to have the feeling that a woman would have as she is right in the middle of the pangs of childbirth. That's how they would feel. Verse 42, And Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, because he hath magnified, he has been too prideful, he has been too arrogant. This is the reason for it. So let us remember the result of Moab if we find ourselves being too prideful. We could be humbled. Of course, this was a physical nation, and we may be humbled, obviously, in a different way. But we don't want to let that take us to judgment. We don't want to be prideful on the day of judgment, because then that destruction would. We want to correct these things before that time, because he hath magnified himself against the Lord. Zephaniah chapter 2. Maybe I can find the book of Zephaniah. It's really small. I have to go to Haggai and go back one. Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 8. You can find Haggai, go back one. There's Zephaniah. Chapter 2 and verse 8. So, this Zephaniah prophesied, if you look in chapter 1 and verse 1, and the word came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. So Zephaniah prophesied then. Well, in chapter 2 and verse 8, Moab is mentioned. Chapter 2 and verse 8 of Zephaniah says, I heard the reproach of Moab and the revelings of the children of Ammon, whereby they have reproached my people and magnified themselves against their border. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord, the host of God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah, even the breeding of nettles and salt pits, a perpetual desolation. The residue of my people shall spoil them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them. So, many years before it was even prophesied by Zephaniah of the calamity and destruction that would come upon Moab because they had magnified themselves, because of their pride. Verse 43, fear. I would look at verses 43 through 45, really paint the picture and give us a good illustration of what Moab can do to prevent this. What can they do to stop this? Fear and the pit and the snare shall be upon them, O inhabitant of Moab, saith the Lord. In other words, complete destruction. Verse 44, but he that fleeth from the fear shall fall in the pit. He that getteth out of the pit shall be taken in the snare. For I will bring upon it, even upon Moab, the year of their visitation, saith the Lord. You think just because you climbed out of the pit, you're going to get away? Well, guess what? There's the snare for you. So there is no escape. Verse 45, they that fled stood under the shadow of Heshbon because of the forest, but a fire shall come up out of Heshbon, and a flame from the midst of Shion, and shall devour the corner of Moab and the crown of the head of the tumultuous ones. In other words, yet again, there is no escape. There's nothing you can do, Moab. Verse 46, woe be unto thee, O Moab, the people of Chemosh perisheth, for thy sons are taken captive. Have you experienced this before, Moab? Guess what? You're going to experience it now. Captivity. And thy daughters are captives. In verse 47, yet will I bring the captivity of Moab in their latter days, saith the Lord. Thus far is the judgment of Moab. And in my mind, there can't be any other thing alluded to here except the coming of Christ. Right now, you're going to experience this captivity. This is the judgment that's coming upon you. But in those latter days, I will bring again the captivity of Moab. In other words, there will be a release. And of course, Christ is going to come into the world. And if they would, and it would be open to them as it was to Jew and Gentile alike, they would have that opportunity, these people in years to come to pass, to obey the gospel. And so that is the judgment of Moab. Next week we'll look at chapter 49, where there's various nations mentioned. We'll start out with the nation of Ammon and then talk about several other nations. Thank you very much.